One day, the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt was waiting in front of his house for a trolley, and he noticed this janitor who was sweeping up the sidewalk. And for some reason, he asked him this question: how do you suppose a composer should write music? And the janitor was quite surprised. Looked at him with big eyes, and he said, I don't know, that's a very curious question. I suppose he should love every single sound. I suppose he should love every single sound. With that comment, I'd like to start talking about the relationship between love and vocation. There's a story, it's a rather well-known story, and if you've heard this story before, I would suggest you listen as if you've not heard it before. There are two Jewish men. One is a scribe, an expert on Jewish law, and there's another man who's a teacher. He's something of a renegade, and this scribe has come to actually test him. So the scribe comes and says, how do I inherit eternal life? And the teacher says, well, what does it say in the law? And the scribe responds, well, you should love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your heart, and all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. The teacher says, do this and you will live. Well, the scribe, he's trying to catch the teacher, and so he says, who is my neighbor? And the teacher proceeds to tell this story. One day, a man is walking from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on his way, he is attacked by robbers. He's beat up, he's stripped, he's robbed, and left half naked on the side of the road. After a while, a Pharisee comes along. Now, the Pharisees were the Jewish priests. The Pharisee comes along, and he sees this man by the side of the road, and he walks by on the other side. Shortly after that, a Levite comes along. And the Levites were the Jews who helped the priests in the temple. And the Levite similarly sees this man and walks by on the other side of the road. A little while later, a Samaritan comes along. Now, Samaritans were related to the Jews, but they were no longer, at this point in history, friends with the Jews. In fact, they seemed to regard each other with animosity. So the Samaritan sees this man by the side of the road, and he decides to help him. He tends to his wounds, picks him up, puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn, stays with him that night, and only leaves the next day and tells the innkeeper, here are 2 days' wages. Take this, care for him, and I'll pay for any of the difference when I return. And the teacher then asks the scribe, which of these people was most like a neighbor to the man by the side of the road? And the scribe says, the Samaritan, he showed him mercy. And the teacher says, go and do likewise. Now, as I said, I want to talk about vocation and love. So let me talk about the story a little bit in relation to vocation, because it's actually central to the story. First of all, the scribe is the one who's asking the question. He's a lawyer. That's his vocation. Then we have the Pharisee, who's the priest, and we have the Levite, who's the assistant to the priest. Why is this relevant? The vocation of the Pharisee, being a priest, the Pharisaic law, or at least the Pharisees interpreted the law as such, that they should not touch someone who was bleeding or wounded or dead. As such, both the Pharisee and the Levite felt they had legitimate reason to pass by this man who was wounded and by the side of the road. I give that as an example of when we use the word vocation in relation to job. That's one way of thinking of vocation. So in this case, vocation has essentially served as an excuse not to show mercy. We don't know what the Samaritan's vocation was, but I would suggest perhaps a different way of thinking about vocation. And this way of thinking about vocation is refers back to the root of the word vocation, which is vox, that is voice. Each of you has a voice. Each of you has a unique voice, right? But your voice doesn't happen until you use it, right? It's silent until you use it. Vocation is like that. Vocation is where our uniqueness finds meaningfulness and activity in our doing. If that's your understanding of vocation, we see the Samaritans' vocation taking place right there, as your vocation as listeners is taking place right now. Well, one thing to keep in mind is at the end of the story, remember the teacher says, go and do likewise. And then think back to the beginning of the story. This story is about loving your neighbor. Well, as I thought about that, it seems to me that perhaps the actions of the Samaritan can be analyzed if one wants to arrive at some sort of definition of love. And here we're not talking about affection or attraction, because I doubt either of those had any sort of bearing in his tending to this man. So what does he do? He engages the man, right? He engages him deeply. I don't know about you, but if I saw someone bleeding by the side of the road, it would take some nerve to actually tend to them. He also ignores the fact there could be robbers waiting for him, also that nobody's watching to praise him if he does it or condemn him if he doesn't. So he's doing this thing not to please somebody or get someone a reward, but simply because he's engaging this other person. Secondly, he's doing this empathetically. That is, as the commandment is, love your neighbor as yourself. That means empathetically, as if that person is yourself. But he's not just doing a good deed, right? He's actually helping this man back to the place where this man can do things. And that's called agency. When you have agency, you have the ability to do something. So here's the description of love, and if you take anything away from this talk, I would suggest taking this and thinking about it. Love is to deeply and empathetically engage the other towards giving the other agency. I'm going to talk about one vocation, and here I'm using the term vocation more in terms of a kind of a job. I'm an artist, and so these ideas I'm talking about, I think about in relation to my own vocation. There's a Spanish painter named Antonio Lopez Garcia. If you know me, you know he's an artist that's influenced me profoundly. And years ago, I saw a film, and in this film, he's been drawing this tree, and he's been doing this for days. And this Chinese artist comes to visit him, and she asks him some questions. They have a long conversation. But a couple of the questions she asks him, I think, are really pertinent to what I'm talking about here. First question is, why did you draw the tree in the middle of the drawing? Our art teacher said that's really a bad idea. That's bad composition. Antonio Lopez Garcia says, it's the most important thing, so I put it in the middle of the drawing. The other thing she inquires about has again to do with this process, and he explains further, as I'm drawing the tree, the quinces on the tree are dropping, they're getting heavier, and so I'm changing my drawing. Now that might not sound revolutionary to you, but it is actually revolutionary in that he is acting with humility in relation to the subject. He is changing his drawing continuously. That's why it's taking him so long, because the thing keeps growing and changing. That concept, which I picked up from reading about him years ago, is utterly convicting as an artist. What does it mean for an artist to have humility in relation to your subject? Well, more recently, as I've been pondering this story that I just told you, I've been thinking about what other ways might we think about that in relation to art. So I'm going to break it down into 4 areas. The first area is your process and your material. And pretty much every vocation would have an equivalent, that is the raw stuff you need to do the thing you're going to do. So when I was in college, the people who taught me, I think they really gave us a strong sense of love for process and materials, but I took that for granted. It wasn't until several years later that when I was learning how to work with egg tempera, I started working with pigments, because I would work with the pigment, grind it with egg yolk and water to make the paint. And when you do that, you learn a lot about what the pigments are and what they do and how they're unique. One pigment in particular, I'll give as an example, is a pigment called terre verte. It's green earth. Terre verte is a very, very weak pigment. For all intents and purposes, for many artists, it would be useless. But I found that when I used this very weak green pigment, it did something that only it could do. What I just described to you is I deeply engaged this material and gave it agency to do what it could do. Okay? So that is a way of understanding how love might enter into your relationship, even with the materials. Did I give the description of love? Yes, I did. So when I said the other in that description of love, the other could be our planet, right? It could be animals. It doesn't just have to be other human beings. So the second area is a subject, and I referred to this already in terms of Antonio Lopez Garcia, but the subject that's been central to my work for much of her life is the person you see on the screen currently. This is my daughter, Temma. She was born in 1985. A day and a half after she was born, she had a cardiac arrest, and there was ensuing brain damage. Initially, the experience that Sherry, my wife, and I had with Temma was that she was profoundly disabled, that she would not be able to do this, to walk, talk, speak, feed herself, pretty much anything that we expect normal humans to do. Well, fortunately, we were able to continue to care with Temma, and over time, slowly we began to understand Temma for who she is, not for who she isn't. She is profoundly other, and it takes a lot of engagement, close engagement, to actually understand who and what she is and what she's doing here. So part of the reason I have made art with Temma increasingly is I hope to, in a sense, give her agency. That is, those things about her that are great and mysterious, to make them present to the world. Thirdly, so it's a process of materials first, then we have your subject, and that can be any number of things. And then you have your community. And my students kind of suffer through this because I make them do studies of other artists, right? And why do I have them do that? Well, it's educational, but that's not really at the heart of it. My feeling is if I or anybody else engage the work of another artist deeply and empathetically, if I try to understand why the artist did what they do, I become a better artist. And in doing that, I actually give them agency, because this artist who lived in 1450 suddenly is doing something in the world, right? Fourthly, the audience, and that would be you or anyone who looks at art. It seems to me quite obvious as artists that we should make art that is accessible, that engages the audience, not as some sort of enemy, but as someone we want to draw into a conversation. And an example of this, years ago when I was in New York, I went to a gallery and there was this artist whose work was there. I saw his work, and driving back to Michigan where I was living, I saw everything differently. Because I saw this person's work, he opened my eyes to see the world differently. I actually can't think of higher praise for an artist. So, a few seconds left here. I would invite you to think about your own vocation. Vocation as job, or vocation as what you're doing in the moment, in the present, in relation to this idea of love and how you might carry that out. Thanks.